In the Cold War 1960s, as Communist China became a nuclear threat, the United States built a remarkably advanced drone to carry out spy missions in a way no manned aircraft or satellite could dream of. A top-secret brainchild of Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works, the D-21 could fly at 3 times the speed of sound from the edge of space, cross the entire length of Asia without appearing on a single radar screen, and photograph clandestine nuclear test sites before anyone on the ground even knew it was there. Getting it in the air would take years, cost lives, and push the limits of what was technically possible. Yet the D-21 would be undone by something none of its designers had anticipated. On the morning of May 1st, 1960, CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers lifted off from a base in Pakistan and pointed his U-2 spy plane north toward the Soviet Union. He had made the trip before. Flying at 70,000 feet, the U-2 had always seemed untouchable, well out of reach of Soviet fighters and missiles. But that morning, as Powers crossed into Soviet airspace over the Ural Mountains, a newly deployed SA-2 surface-to-air missile battery fired at him. The U-2's tail was shredded. The aircraft broke apart. Powers survived, was captured, and within days was paraded before the world's press as proof of American espionage. The international fallout was immediate and severe. President Eisenhower, humiliated, had no choice but to announce the end of all manned reconnaissance flights over Soviet territory. At a stroke, America's most valuable window into the Soviet military had been slammed shut. The timing could hardly have been worse. Spy satellite technology was still years from delivering reliable intelligence. In the interim, American analysts were operating partially blind, unable to monitor Soviet missile sites, bomber bases, or nuclear facilities with any confidence. The intelligence community needed a solution, and it needed one fast. The answer, many believed, lay not in sending men into harm's way, but in sending machines. If a drone could fly high enough and fast enough, it might go where no pilot could safely follow. The question was whether anyone could actually build such a thing. If there was one man who could, it was Clarence Kelly Johnson, the legendary chief engineer of Lockheed's secretive Skunk Works division. Johnson had already designed the U-2 that Powers had been flying, and before that, a string of aircraft that had redefined what was considered possible. In October 1962, the CIA and the U.S. Air Force handed him a new set of outlandish requirements: a pilotless reconnaissance drone, capable of sustained flight at Mach 3.3 to 3.5, operating at altitudes between 87 and 95,000 feet, with a range of 3,000 nautical miles. It would fly in, photograph the target, and never come back, ejecting its film payload for retrieval before destroying itself to prevent capture. Even for Kelly Johnson, this was a serious challenge. Fortunately, he had a head start. Johnson borrowed heavily from the A-12 manned Mach 3 reconnaissance aircraft he'd already been building. His new drone, initially designated Q-12, would use the same titanium construction that allowed the A-12 to withstand the intense heat generated by sustained supersonic flight, and the same design features that reduced its radar cross-section, making it difficult for enemy tracking systems to detect. The drone would essentially be a smaller, unmanned distillation of everything Skunk Works had already learned. This allowed a full-scale mock-up to be ready by December 7, 1962, barely 2 months after Johnson had received his instructions. But the Q-12 wasn't simply a shrunken A-12. With a length of just under 43 feet and a wingspan of 19 feet, it had the look of something that had been carved off the end of a blackbird's wing, a sleek, futuristic, angular delta shape. Power came from a modified Marquardt RJ-43 ramjet, the same basic engine used on the CIM-10 Beaumark surface-to-air missile, yet substantially redesigned to sustain operation at extreme altitude and temperature for an hour and a half or more, far beyond anything the original engine had been built to do. The drone would fly a pre-programmed route over its target, then eject a detachable camera module, called the Hatch, over friendly territory. A specially equipped JC-130 Hercules would attempt to snatch it from the air. If that failed, Navy ships would retrieve it from the ocean. A barometrically triggered explosive charge would then destroy the drone at low altitude, leaving nothing for anyone to examine. By March 1963, Lockheed had its contract. The most ambitious drone program in American history was officially underway. As the year drew to an end, the project was given a name, Tagboard, and its aircraft would have new identities to match. The Q-12 would henceforth be known as the D-21, the D standing for daughter, while the modified A-12s that would carry it aloft became the M-21, the mother. 2 A-12 airframes were pulled from the production line and rebuilt for the role, fitted with a second cockpit for a launch control officer and a fuselage pylon to carry the drone aloft. Lockheed test pilot Bill Park was assigned to fly them. Captive flight testing began in December 1964. The first live launch came on March 5, 1966, with Park accelerating to Mach 3.2 before releasing the D-21 over the Pacific. 2 more launches followed that spring and summer, each one pushing further and performing better than the last. By the third flight, the drone had covered 1,550 nautical miles, executed 8 programmed turns, and photographed several islands from 92,000 feet. The only failure was a minor electronics fault that prevented the camera hatch from ejecting. The program managers were encouraged by what they saw, but Johnson remained uneasy. The drone was performing well enough, but he was concerned about what happened in the moment of separation, when 2 aircraft flying at Mach 3 had to part ways cleanly, with no room for error. The 4th test, scheduled for July 30th, 1966, would show who had read the situation correctly. This test differed from its predecessors in one critical respect. The previous 3 launches had all been executed during a slight pushover maneuver, a carefully calculated outside loop that used gravity to assist the separation. This time, the decision was made to launch straight and level. As Park and his launch control officer, Ray Torek, accelerated to Mach 3.25 over the Pacific, the D-21 was released from the pylon. Instead of pulling cleanly away, it passed through the M-21's bow wake and suffered an engine unstart, a sudden, violent disruption of airflow through the ramjet. In an instant, the drone veered back into the mothership, striking the tail. At those speeds, the impact was catastrophic. The M-21 pitched sharply upward, the forces tearing the forward fuselage from the wing structure. The aircraft disintegrated around its crew. Both men ejected. Both survived the breakup, but Torek's pressure suit was torn during his plunge into the ocean, and it filled with water. Recovery vessels reached the scene too late. Bill Park, who floated in the Pacific for over an hour before a helicopter reached him some 150 miles from the California coast, later recalled watching the wreckage fall from the sky. He could do nothing. A chase aircraft, crewed by Lockheed pilot Art Peterson and LCO Keith Beswick, had witnessed and filmed the entire sequence from a distance. The footage left no ambiguity about what had happened. Back on the ground, Kelly Johnson watched it in silence. The loss devastated him. Johnson had raised his concerns about the M-21 and D-21 combination throughout the test program. Now, one of his aircraft was at the bottom of the ocean. He'd lost one of his crew, and his pilot had nearly drowned. According to those present, he was so shaken that he initially refused to continue the program and offered to return the government's money. It was an extraordinary gesture, and it was rejected. The intelligence community had invested too much in Project Tagboard to walk away. The D-21's potential was undiminished. The problem was simply the launch method. If the M-21 was too dangerous a platform, they would find another one. Johnson, persuaded to remain, turned his attention to a very different kind of mothership. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress was, in almost every respect, the opposite of the M-21. Where the Blackbird was a razor-edged machine designed to outrun anything that came at it, the B-52 was a lumbering giant, a Cold War workhorse that cruised at subsonic speeds and hauled its payload in sheer brute quantity rather than finesse. As a launch platform for the world's fastest drone, it seemed an almost absurd choice. But it had one crucial advantage. It would keep its crew out of the danger zone. Since the B-52 couldn't approach the speeds needed to ignite the D-21's ramjet, a large solid-fuel rocket booster would distract the drone's underside to do the job, firing for 87 seconds before falling away. The vertical stabilizer was enlarged for added stability. New attachment points for the underwing pylons were fitted, and the modified drone received a new designation, D-21B. 2 B-52Hs were converted to carry a pair each, their rear crew stations replaced with launch control consoles. The new configuration was safer in theory. In practice, it had its own ideas. The very first attempted launch, on September 28, 1967, ended before it began. The drone fell off the pylon on the way to the launch point after a nut stripped on the mounting hardware. Johnson described the incident as, quote, very embarrassing. 3 subsequent launches between November 1967 and January 1968 all fell short of complete success. A further attempt in April 1968 failed when the engine refused to ignite. Then, on June 16, 1968, nearly 2 years after Ray Torek had drowned in the Pacific, a D-21B finally completed a full mission successfully. More test flights followed, not all of them clean, but by the autumn of 1969, the program's managers decided they'd seen enough. The D-21B was ready for its real mission. The question now was what exactly it was being sent to find. At the end of the 1960s, the United States had a problem it couldn't solve from space. China had detonated its first atomic warhead in 1964, and Washington was increasingly anxious about what was happening at Beijing's nuclear test facility at Lop Nor, a vast remote salt flat in the Xinjiang desert. Spy satellites, still in their relative infancy, were proving frustratingly inadequate for the job. A September 1969 memo from the Joint Chiefs of Staff laid out the situation in blunt terms. 93% of high-priority targets in southern China had received no photographic coverage in the previous 2 months. Sending a manned aircraft was politically unthinkable. The memory of Gary Powers was still fresh, and a similar incident over China could prove even more destabilizing. As the Joint Chiefs put it, the drone had been developed precisely because manned overflights of China risked incidents that would be, quote, potentially embarrassing to the United States. The Joint Chiefs acknowledged that Chinese radar would almost certainly detect an incoming D-21, but assessed that Beijing's SA-2 missile batteries posed no realistic threat to a drone traveling at Mach 3 above 80,000 feet. The missions, codenamed Senior Bowl, would be flown by the 4,200 Support Squadron out of Beale Air Force Base in California, operating from Anderson Air Force Base in Guam. Each B-52 would carry 2 D-21Bs, the second serving as a backup should the first malfunction on the way to the launch point. On the night of November 9, 1969, a lone B-52 lifted off from Beale and turned west toward the Pacific. The most expensive, most secret drone America had ever built was heading into Chinese airspace. The B-52 reached its launch point beyond the range of Chinese early warning radar and released the D-21B into the pre-dawn darkness. The booster ignited, the ramjet caught, and the drone climbed to its operational altitude of 84,000 feet, accelerating to Mach 3.27. From the ground, there was nothing to do but wait. For a time, everything appeared to be working. The drone crossed into Chinese airspace on schedule, heading toward Lop Nor. Then, without warning, it simply stopped following its programmed route. Instead of turning back toward the recovery point after completing its run, it continued straight on, heading north. Kelly Johnson could only conclude that the guidance system had failed catastrophically. The D-21 flew on past its target, past the point of no return, and across the vast emptiness of northern China, before running out of fuel somewhere over Siberia. Johnson believed it had then crashed in Soviet territory. The first operational mission of Project Senior Bowl had ended without a single photograph, without a single piece of recoverable wreckage, and without either side publicly acknowledging it had happened. In Washington, the program's managers ordered a corrective test flight, which took place in February 1970 and was reported as successful. Whatever had sent the first drone off course appeared to have been identified and fixed. With confidence restored, the second operational mission was authorized. The second Senior Bowl mission launched on December 16, 1970, over a year after the first. This time, the D-21B performed exactly as designed. Crossed into Chinese airspace, reached Lac Nord, completed its photographic run, and turned back toward the recovery point. After everything the program had been through, it must have seemed for a brief moment like the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. Then the hatch was ejected. Its parachute system, which had functioned without issue in testing, suffered a partial failure on deployment. The JC-130 circling overhead had no chance of making the air snatch. Navy ships were dispatched to retrieve it from the ocean, but the hatch had already sunk by the time they arrived. Somewhere at the bottom of the Pacific lay the first photographs the D-21 had ever taken of Lac Nord, completely unrecoverable. It was the kind of failure that defied easy explanation. The drone itself had done everything right. The enemy had played no part in it. The mission had been undone by a malfunctioning parachute, a mundane mechanical fault in an otherwise extraordinary machine. For the teams at Beale and at Skunk Works, it must have been almost harder to bear than an outright failure. Back in Washington, the lack of results was starting to raise eyebrows. Each D-21B cost $2.5 million to build, equivalent to over $15 million today. The modifications of the A-12s and B-52s had also contributed to the program's rising costs. However, the mood was not entirely one of frustration. While the men running Senior Bowl were consumed with questions of parachutes and recovery procedures, others in the Capitol were asking something else. What if the D-21 was better suited to a different kind of mission entirely? One that came with an even greater responsibility. In January 1971, John McLucas, director of the National Reconnaissance Office, sent a memo to Deputy Defense Secretary David Packard. The subject was a proposal that had been quietly circulating among senior military planners, converting the D-21 into an unmanned nuclear strike platform. The logic was not as outlandish as it might sound. Here was a vehicle that could already travel over 3,000 miles at Mach 3, flying higher than any interceptor could reach. If it could carry a camera along a precise, pre-programmed route and release it at an exact moment, it could just as easily carry nuclear warheads and deliver them to multiple targets along a single route, something a ballistic missile, locked onto one trajectory from the moment of launch, could never do. And unlike a missile, it could, in theory, be recalled. McLucas and Packard had discussed the concept with the air staff and was prepared to do whatever additional analysis might be required. The language was measured and bureaucratic, but the implication was extraordinary. The same machine that had just lost its film somewhere at the bottom of the Pacific was being seriously considered as a potential instrument of nuclear war. McLucas waited for Packard's response. In the meantime, Senior Bowl's operational missions continued, with the third launching on March 4, 1971. For a second time in a row, the D-21B performed flawlessly. It reached Lac Nord, completed its run, returned to the recovery point, and ejected the hatch. This time, the parachute deployed. But the air pickup chute had been lost during the flight, leaving the JC-130 unable to make the snatch. Once again, the hatch fell into the ocean. A Navy destroyer was dispatched to retrieve it before it sank. The ship arrived on time to find the hatch still floating, but as she maneuvered to recover it, she struck it. The impact sent it straight to the ocean floor. 3 successful flights over Lac Nord, 3 sets of photographs lost, each time in a different, more excruciating way. The fourth Senior Bowl mission launched on March 20th, 1971. This one never came back. The D-21B was lost somewhere over China's Yunnan province, its wreckage discovered by local authorities and eventually put on display at the China Aviation Museum in Beijing. The most secret drone America had ever built was now a public exhibit in the country it had been sent to spy on. Back in Washington, the program's fate had already been the subject of discussion at the highest levels. Upon receiving John McLucas's memo proposing the conversion of the D-21 into a nuclear strike platform, David Packard wrote his response directly on the page, quote, "Johnny, you've answered my question. The cost is too high. It's probably too high even for its present mission. The D-21 would have no future as a nuclear bomber drone. At the same time, any hopes of it reaching its potential as a reconnaissance tool were rapidly dwindling. In addition to its poor success rate and spiraling costs, there was a change in the political climate. President Nixon was quietly pursuing a historic opening to China, and sending spy drones into Chinese airspace was not compatible with that ambition. What's more, a new generation of satellites that could perform the reconnaissance role more reliably was now on the way. Kelly Johnson had seen this coming as far back as 1959, when he had asked the CIA whether there'd be one round of aircraft development or two before satellites took over. The CIA replied there would only be one. Johnson concurred. In June 1971, the first Big Bird satellite was launched. It could operate for months at a time, mapping entire regions, and posed no risk of leaving wreckage in enemy territory. The following month, the D-21 program was formally canceled. In the end, the full program, including the A-12 and B-52 modifications, had cost the equivalent of around $440 million in today's money. Officially, it had only conducted 4 missions. All failed. However, it's been suggested that there were in fact others which never appeared in any declassified documents. According to writer Lloyd Spanberger, a Cold War intelligence officer named Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Crane told him that at least 2 additional Senior Bowl missions may have taken place. In both cases, Crane claimed the hatch was successfully recovered. However, in the first, improper film processing equipment caused the photographic emulsion to separate from its base, destroying every image the drone had captured. On the second, the development process was completed without incident, and usable photographs were finally in hand. Whether those images ever yielded actionable intelligence remains unknown. The additional missions have never been confirmed. After the program's cancellation, the 17 surviving D-21Bs were trucked to storage at Norton Air Force Base in California, and later moved to the aircraft boneyard at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, where they sat in the desert sun alongside rows of obsolete trainers and transports. The Air Force listed them as GT D-21Bs. The GT is standing for ground training, a bureaucratic fiction designed to obscure what they actually were. It didn't work for long. The base was open to the public, and visitors quickly spotted the strange, sleek shapes that didn't belong among the propeller planes. Officials tried to explain them away as prototype test vehicles for the A-12 program, but questions would persist. The program remained officially classified until the 1980s. It was only in February 1986 that one loose thread was finally tied up. A CIA official arrived at the Lockheed office of Ben Rich, who'd worked on the D-21 program, and handed him a metal panel. He asked if Rich could identify it. Rich recognized it immediately. It was a piece of the engine mount from the drone that had gone missing on the first Senior Bowl mission in November 1969. The CIA official explained that it had been given to him by a Soviet KGB agent who said a Siberian shepherd had found it. The drone had crashed in the Soviet Union, exactly as Kelly Johnson had suspected. The Soviets, it turned out, had done rather more than simply find the wreckage. Their engineers had studied it carefully, and the Tupolev Design Bureau had produced plans for a Soviet copy, designated the Voron, or Raven. It was never built. By the time the wreck had been fully analyzed, spy satellites rendered the entire concept obsolete on both sides. Of the 38 D-21s and D-21Bs built, 21 were expended in flight. The rest ended up in museums across the United States, and one remains in Beijing. The D-21 was, depending on how you looked at it, either one of the most impressive flying machines America ever built, or proof that even the most extraordinary creations can fall short of the impossible things asked of them. NRO Director John McLucas, the man who suggested the D-21 as a nuclear strike platform, left one final thought on the record. In the program's final months, he wrote, quote, I believe that there is a weapons-carrying role for drones which ought to be exploited." He was right, of course. Just 50 years too early. Armed drones now fly combat missions across the world, hunting targets with a precision the D-21's designers could barely have imagined. They've changed the nature of modern warfare more profoundly than almost any other technology of the past half-century. McLucas saw it coming. He just couldn't save the program that pointed the way.